Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Rose. I'm the MGP Program Manager for Sevenson Environmental. I'll be moderating this session this morning. This is session one in situ remediation case studies. We have an all-star lineup of panels today. We're started a little. We're started a little 5 minutes late because you guys ran over the last session. So we'll get back on track here. Our first presenter for the day is Geoffrey Schaefer, as a PE for wood environment, and his discussion is going to be on combined in situ chemical oxidation and aerobic bioremediation for site closures. So no further ado, Jeff, take the stage.
Great, thank you, Gary. So like Gary said, my name is Jeff Schaefer. I've been working for Wood Environment Infrastructure Solutions and its various states of names before that for the last 27 years. I'm based out of Tallahassee, Florida. And I don't know if Steve is in here or not, but I appreciated his story this morning. I love to live in an old house. I drive old cars. I love to restore things and bring them back. And so I really appreciated his story of restoration, which is really what we do for a living. We find problems and we fix them so that it makes the world a better place, or it brings it back to its original state, or sometimes better. And it really was helpful to me to have stories to relate to the reason why I do what I do. And so thanks for Steve, if you're in here, thanks for sharing your story and helping remind us of what we're doing and the importance of it. So that being said, I decided to try and present this year for two different reasons. One is I wanted to, it seemed like the trend in conferences was a lot of vendors would be doing presentations for consultants. And I felt like we needed to kind of claim some of that back. So we do the work, they help us do the work, and they do sometimes do a better job than we do presenting. But I feel like we should own a little bit of that and pour back into it. So I wanted to do that. And then I also wanted to present a site that really wasn't exciting. I know talking to some junior people, sometimes the idea of presenting at a conference can be intimidating because a lot of the presentations are really exciting, right? They're big sites. There's lots of colors and graphs and models and all kinds of things. And so it's not what we do every day usually. Usually it's just kind of the bread and butter site. So I wanted to present something that was a little bit more bread and butter, to just say, like, we can do this. We can talk about the things that we do every day and the success that the everyday projects bring. So So I'm going to talk about a petroleum restoration program site. It's in Crawfordville, Florida, just south of Tallahassee, Florida, and is a retail gas station, C-store. It started in 1978. You can see here, Crawfordville, just standard maps. There's, I don't think this pointer is really going to work, but it's a pretty small site. The USTs are co-located with the canopy and the dispensers, so it makes for a nice compact source area, but also makes for a small site because they only did that for one reason, because they didn't have any space. So that being said, like I said, the site opened. Let's see. Let's go back one. That's okay. Well, something's wrong with the slide set. So we'll go forward. Used to be a lithology diagram here, but I only have circles. So anyway, this site, something happened with the presentation, but the site is pretty typical of the area. There's sandier soils for the first probably 15, 20 feet, transitioning to clay soils. And then there's a small clay layer that's about 10 feet thick above, transitioning to weathered limestone and then competent limestone. And if anybody's familiar with the area, the Wakulla Springs Shed Basin has a lot of caves. A lot of people like to dive in those caves because they're crazy. And they have really high gradients and conductivity, as you can see here. And then also it was interesting at this site, typically we see pretty aerobic conditions at these sites, but this site in particular, the average DO concentration was in the 0.2 range. So we identified 3 zones here, but it was just because those are the depths of the wells were installed as we were chasing the vertical extent of contamination. There are no confining units between those zones to actually separate them from one another. So Oh, there it is. You knew. Okay, so there's your lithology cross-section, like I described. Again, there were unleaded fuel only that was stored at this site. The discharge notification was in 1987 under the EDI program, and there was tanks were removed. And when they removed that, they dug out about 2,000 tons of material. And so there really was not a ton of soil contamination. Matter of fact, the CAR said that there was no soil contamination on site. And later on, they did a RAP for an air sparge SV and a pump and treat system. But again, the SVE was just for vapor capture. It wasn't geared towards cleaning up any soil contamination. 2013, the system got shut down, and it mostly got shut down because DEP was transitioning out of the petroleum, the pre-approval program into the PRP program. The site had reached NAM levels, and so they were shutting systems down. So that's the main reason that the system got shut down. And yeah, so. And then the system really did a pretty good job. If you'll see over here over here is the pre-system plume. It was quite a large plume. It was about 400 feet long, about 200 feet wide. Is in the right of way. It was on offsite properties. And then the system, you can see on the other side here, after they shut the system down, it was below NAM. And the plume was mostly on site, a little bit in the local right of way there. But generally speaking, the system did a good job, but the plume started to rebound, and the concentration wasn't getting bigger anymore, but the concentrations were going up, and they returned to above natural attenuation levels. So DEP authorized us to do a supplemental site assessment. We suspected that there was probably still some soil contamination on site, since we were seeing increases in concentration, and that we were also, so the NAM levels, we had rebounded above NAM, and that indicated to us that it was probably a source. Went out and did a bunch of soil borings, collected a bunch of soil samples, including SPLP and all that good stuff. And we identified a relatively significant smear zone and some residual groundwater that we knew we already had. There actually was no soil contamination on site, which was a pleasant surprise. But because we have a pretty good smear zone, anywhere from 14 to 18, 19 feet, and it was in that clayer zone, the system that was in place was just never going to cut it at this site. So we looked at pursuing a new conceptual site model that identified these things and the areas that we really needed to target to be able to move forward towards closure. DEP authorized us to prepare a remedial action plan modification, which we did in 2016. We looked at a bunch of different options. We looked at reinstalling a system. We did have some infrastructure that was still there as far as the air sparge wells, SV wells, and the like. And so we looked at, do we want to reinstall a system? We ultimately decided against that, and we were leaning towards doing some kind of in situ remediation at this site. Looked at a bunch of different products to inject. We looked at, we looked at fentans, we looked at persulfate, we looked at carbon, and all that good new stuff. And ultimately, we settled on PeroxyChem, now known as Evonik. Their closure, it's a persulfate oxidant. And the main reason we selected this is it's been shown to work well on BTEX compounds. It also has been shown to work really well in basic environments. And so we had a limestone aquifer, and rather than fight that pH battle to try and get it for a Fenton's reaction or something like that, we decided that we would just go with a persulfate, which is an alkaline activated persulfate. So the closure SP, we use two products, closure SP and closure CR. The closure SP is a sodium hydroxide activated persulfate, and we use this in the groundwater zone from about 18, we'll see in a second, 18 to 26 feet. And it basically is an NaOH activated persulfate. You get three different radicals. You get a sulfate radical, a peroxide radical, and O2 radical. And this serves to attack the organic molecules effectively. And additionally, the peroxide is a longer lasting chemical compared to a Fenton's reagent. So it activates in the groundwater, and it's persistent for generally 3 weeks, 3 months is that kind of time frame, depending on the actual site, versus something that might be over and done with in the matter of days. So it gives us a slightly larger ROI. So again, the closure CR is essentially, it's just the SP product combined with the Permeox Ultra, which is a calcium peroxide product that is basically self-activating. It allows us to not have to inject the sodium hydroxide. So it's a good product, and we chose it to use in the soil areas because the soil, if you're pumping the hydroxide in, we find that it doesn't work very well. It doesn't stay there, it likes to go down into the water. And so you don't get as good of activation. Whereas if you're co-injecting them together, then the self-activation of the decomposition of the Permeox allows that to actively treat the soil contamination and the smear zone contamination in this case. So the CR also, because of the Permeox, we get a big DO boost in that. So it provides, after the peroxide has done its thing, you continue to get that degradation of the Permeox. And so because of that, you get an enhanced bio effect afterwards. It also has been shown to provide an anaerobic bioremediation. Once that DO is gone, you have the sulfate residual from the sodium persulfate, and you can get an anaerobic biodegradation from that. We have not seen it at the site, but that is a tertiary benefit to the CR, the closure CR. So again, just the site history, we did baseline sampling prior to the first phase of injections. You can see, it's not real easy to see, but over here we did the green are the phase 1 injections, and then there's some lighter colored pink or red locations for what you'll see will be the phase 2 injection afterwards. So in addition to doing the phase 1 injections, the offsite property owner, who is not the same RP, has said, get your stuff off my property. And so we went out and we removed all the infrastructure. The remedial system was on a slab, and there were a bunch of horizontal or angled wells under the road here. So we removed all the well vaults and all that kind of good stuff. And then later on in 2020, he asked us to remove the infiltration gallery, which if anybody's removed one, it's good fun. The rock was actually in quite good condition, good enough condition that FDOT allowed us to leave it to move it to their yard down the road, and they reused it for rock base later. So if you are in a position where you have to remove one, this was in quite good condition. I was surprised. I know John talked about a lot of iron fouling, and we expected a lot of this rock to be cemented together and be really difficult to move, but it was actually pretty easy. So for phase 1, we did phase 1 injections in February of 2018. And we did 55 injection locations. We used a standard DPT rig with the pressure pump, the double diaphragm pressure pumps, and on-site mixing tanks to create this. This was the average, you can see in the table, average volume that we wanted to inject in each interval based on the data that we collected in the supplemental site assessment and the baseline groundwater data. And for the most part, we were able to do that. It was a little bit tricky in some areas, as you can imagine. The site's not homogeneous, and so we had a little bit of trouble. But on average, we were able to get those volumes into the areas that we wanted them to go. And at the end of the day, during phase 1, we injected 3,488 pounds of the closure SP product in the groundwater and 5,496 pounds of the closure CR product into the smear zone, with the addition of the sodium hydroxide for the activation in the groundwater. If you're not familiar with the products, they do come shipped on pallets, and they come in bags and pails. And then the blue drum is the sodium hydroxide that comes there. They're caustic chemicals. And so we cordoned off an area with orange construction fencing and barricades and all that kind of good stuff to keep people out. This was a very rural area, so it wasn't a high traffic area, but yeah, you have to treat them accordingly. Here's a photo of the phase 1 injections. It's Huss Environmental Drilling did this for us, And they did a great job. You can see just a regular DPT rig and then connecting to the top of the well. You can see that we're injecting these things right. You can see the UST pit is right there next to the canopy and partially under it. And we injected right next to it, had no problems with anything. And it was really effective. I guess I should give preferred did the phase 2 injection, but I don't have any good pictures of them, so they didn't get in. So, but thanks, Chad. So phase 1, the injections for phase 1, again, we were right at the NAM levels, but we knew we were never going to get there, and the concentrations were going up quarter after quarter. And so xylenes were really our driving parameter. We were somewhere around the 220, 250 range, so just above natural attenuation for xylenes. And then we had benzene, ethylbenzene, but they were well below the not natural attenuation, but still above GCTLs. And then with every injection chemical that we have, there's a UIC zone of discharge parameters that we have to monitor. In this case, there were 5 of them that we had to keep track of. So TDS, sulfate, sodium, manganese, and iron. Here real quick. So you can see a little bit better here, in the baseline sampling, there were 2. You can see this plume and this one here. Those were what were in the intermediate zone. So they were a little bit deeper. They really just touched the top of that smear zone and then below. So mostly really just dissolved phase contamination with a little bit there. And then the other location here, that was the shallower zone. And so it had a lot of contact with that smear zone. The other wells, even though we found a smear zone concentration in these other areas, the other wells were showing no impacts from desorption from that smear zone. So it was really just focusing on those 3 areas for the injections. So we did the injection. It took about 3 weeks to do those 55 DPT points. And afterwards, all the intermediate contamination was gone. It was consistently below GCTLs. We haven't never seen it come back since then. However, the area around MW6 did have some rebound. Well, not really rebound, but we just only got about 50% of the reduction that we wanted from the injections in MW6. But like I said, it was in that zone that had a lot more contact with the smear zones, contaminated soils. So we continued to monitor. You can see here the trend for MW6 on the side. It had to drop, and then it kind of just bouncing back and forth at about 100 or so, 7,500 micrograms per liter xylene above the GCTL. Here's some graphs of the UIC results. So we're tracking the UIC zone of discharge parameters. And as the case with a lot of these sites, sometimes you can get rid of the contamination really quickly, and then you're stuck waiting for these things to go away, right? It's like, oh man, that's not cool. But here we are. So you saw some of them, they went up really high like we expected, and they came down really quickly. Some of the other ones, particularly TDS at this site and a lot of sites, is the driving thing that's making you continue to monitor going forward after you get destruction. And it's the case here, and you'll see after phase 2, it'll be similar, not to give you a spoiler. So again, just continuing in site history, we did the injection in 2018. We continued to do PARM sampling. It was looking really good for that deep or that intermediate zone dissolve phase, but the shallower zone was giving us some problems. So we looked to DEP to allow us to do a phase 2 injection, and they agreed with that. So we went to that MW6. We spaced ourselves out from that well appropriately, and we put 8 injection points around MW6. Basically following the same procedures that we did for phase 1. However, this time we took a little bit more time because we were having some difficulty, like I said before, getting some of the closure CR into that really the clayer interval of that smear zone. So we took a little bit more time under lower pressures to inject that material. It took about another 3/4 of a day or day longer than we wanted to do those 8 injection points, but we got the material exactly where we wanted it. And so at the end of the day, we were able to inject 661 pounds of the the closure SP into the saturated zone, and then 675 pounds of the closure CR into the beta or the smear zone. Sorry. And so what happened then? Well, here you go. It's just again our starting parameters, the same UIC monitoring, and we did the injections. And so after injections, you can see on the trend graph we had great results. There's the injection, and then it immediately started to drop. And so once after we had one sampling event where it was still above GCTLs, the second sampling event it was below, and then it's remained below GCTLs each time. This blip just comes just under the limit. So we have our 4 quarters of clean sampling post that. And additionally, I wanted to mention, I didn't have a graph. I thought about it too late to get it into the slideshow, but I mentioned that the aquifer static conditions, the DO was about 0.2. After we were doing these sampling, the injections after phase 1, we didn't get a huge boost in DO, but after phase 2, it really went up significantly, where our DOs were in the mid 7s for probably about 6 months, and then started to drop down, and we're still above about 2.8 consistently now. So we're still have a really good DO signature that is, I think helping to keep that plume from rebounding and providing that natural attenuation augmentation that we were hoping for. Again, here's the UIC results after phase 2. And so you can see that again, it's primarily TDS, this line on here, this thick black line, that's the secondary drinking water standard. So the first data point is the background sampling data, and then there's a second drinking water standard. And then you can see that that for the most part, we have some issues with iron, although it's getting close to background. It's still well above the secondary drinking water standard, but it always was and is in a lot of cases. But TDS is really the one that's taking the longest, and I think will be the driver. But we do see a downward trend in all of these that are giving us an issue that are still above the background concentrations, and we expect them to probably return to background concentrations in the next probably 1 or 2 sampling events. This most recent data is from October, last month. So let's see. So as soon as we, again, this is just a text summary of the PARM sampling that we've been doing. And then conclusions. So basically at this point, we've met our GCTL target levels for all the site wells. We're still having some issues with GCT or with the zone of discharge parameters, but they're giving us a downward trend, and we're monitoring those. And we expect to be able to recommend closure in the next, say, 3 to 6 months, ideally. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you to DEP and the PRP program. They funded this project, and they were very helpful in making it move forward effectively and efficiently. Proxychem, now Evonik, they provided the chemicals, and FRC, thank you for allowing me to present this talk. So with that, I'll take any questions. Yes. Yeah, so we weren't given a pilot test for this site, so we have done it, and it's okay, right? I mean, the industry has done so much work in these areas that a lot of times we don't need the pilot test data, but we have done, as Wood, we've done injections in the area, so we knew what we kind of would expect. We knew if we went too deep, we were going to lose it all. It was going to hit the limestone, and it was just, we were going to get, I mean, it's going to get an amazing down gradient radius of influence. But so we were really careful to keep it into the zone that we wanted to get. And we were relatively conservative with the I don't know, probably not worth going back, but if you saw the spacing on those injection wells, it wasn't a great grid, but they were pretty tight. The grid was very wonky because we had to deal with the source area that was around the tanks and the canopies and the lines and the vents and all that stuff. So it was a little bit off, but we were pretty conservative. We were using 7.5 feet for our radius, if that's helpful. Yes. We had no solubility issues with the product itself. We mix in the mixing tanks, we got it in, and as long as we were mixing it per the standard or the directions that PeroxyChem gave us, we didn't have any problems. The pressures were varied. Like I said, some of the pressures we were 10, 15 psi. Some of them were 40, 50 psi. I don't recall anything going much above that, but it was really selective depending on the heterogeneity of the actual, and it varied from location to location, which is why injection 2, phase 2 was I felt like it was much more successful introduction of the chemical to the subsurface because we had that phase 1 information to go on.
Question here.
Yes.
How did you establish your background levels for your inorganics?
We just took background samples.
How many, and did you do any statistical analysis?
We did not. We just went, so we had a site where nothing had been injected. We went to the outside the impacted areas, and then we went to up gradient, down gradient, and cross gradient. We collected samples, and we said that's baseline for the chemical injections.
I'm just thinking your tough point at the end is going to be trying to establish that, yes, you have returned to background and are going to stay there.
Yeah, so maybe background might be a bit of a misnomer. Maybe pre-injection conditions might be better. not truly background in like in the sense that we're talking about like natives unimpacted, because there could have been some kind of adverse impact from the spill that we're not aware of, but we would never be aware of that.
What was the starting concentrations on it, Jeff? I didn't see that slide.
Before the remedial system went in, or before we did the injections?
Before you did the injection.
Before we did the injections, the driving contaminant was xylene, and it was around 250 dissolve phase. I can tell you, I have the data for the soil. It was quite high in the smear zone for the soil for a variety of different contaminants, but xylene was the driving dissolve phase, and it was around 250 micrograms per liter.
That's pretty low for chemox usually. So it's just.
It is, but it was a cost benefit ratio. What are we going to do to get this site over the line? Because it was clear that NAM wasn't working and the concentrations were going back up, and we didn't want a situation where we were now going to create an offsite plume again, particularly since we just removed all of the offsite infrastructure for the remedial system. So it was a pretty quick, easy addressing of a minimal common concentration, and then in 2 years we're ready to hopefully recommend closure.
Okay.
But yeah, again, if you guys came in late, I started with part of my desire for this talk was to just present a site that a lot of us might touch 4, 5, 6 times a year on a regular basis. This is stuff we do every day, and it might not be super exciting and colorful, but it's still important to know that this is the kind of stuff we work on every day, and you can get success in pretty simple ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So our next speaker, we have Andrew Lowy from Provectus Environmental Products. He is going to discuss today combining traditional and advanced in situ remedial methods to address source petroleum hydrocarbon mass. So Adam.
Thank you for that great introduction, Gary, and I appreciate being here at FRC today, and thank you for attending my presentation. As Gary mentioned, my name is Andy Lowy with Provectus Environmental. I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona, and today we'll be talking about combining traditional and advanced in situ remedial methods to address petroleum hydrocarbon contaminant mass. So before we dive into the technical portion of the talk, I'll go over an outline of what we'll be discussing. This will include a small brief introduction to Provectus Environmental. Then we'll delve into what is in situ chemical oxidation, or what is ISCO. We'll go over the mode of action as well as oxidation potentials and how that relates to contaminant mass destruction. Then we'll look at 3 of the main recognized limitations I see with ISCO, which include the oxidant demand, contaminant rebound, as well as oxidant longevity. And then on the back end, we'll talk about the ferric iron activated persulfate technologies that Provectus offers, as well as a couple of case studies, which will include a permeable reactive barrier approach and a backfill source amendment excavation approach. So just a quick introduction to Provectus. We were first incorporated in May of 2014. On our day-to-day basis, we focus on environmental remediation, including ISCO and ISCR projects, as well as aerobic and anaerobic bioremediation technologies and methane inhibition. Our backgrounds here include environmental consulting, remediation contracting, and the development of advanced technologies. And we utilize turnkey design and implementation partnerships across the globe to help us successfully complete project sites. So let's dive into the technical portion of the talk. Essentially, what is ISCO in its simplest form? Well, that's the removal of electrons from contaminants in order to oxidize them. This is a simplified chart that I like to show that basically shows that reaction where your contaminant is located in the middle. And then on the bottom left corner, you can see that as it loses its electron, it becomes oxidized. And that's essentially what ISCO is. The thing I like to point out, though, about ISCO, it's also a non-selective technology, meaning that when these chemicals are applied, not only will they target the contaminants of concern in the subsurface, but they will also oxidize any naturally occurring organics as well. So just keep that in mind when using these technologies. So as we know, the stronger the oxidizer, the higher the oxidation potential you're going to have. And we know that within the class of ISCO technologies, there's many reagents you can utilize, from fentans to persulfate to hydrogen peroxide to permanganate. And these all have various oxidation potentials. Up towards the top end of this chart, we can see the hydroxyl radical, which is commonly formed in fentans reagent. This has the benefit of being able to treat a wide range of contaminants, but it does have a few drawbacks, such as the short lifespan in the subsurface. And it can also be difficult to apply in reactive soils. Just below that, we have the sulfate radical. This is common in activated persulfate. And I'm going to distinguish here a little bit between what I call common activated persulfate, as well as the ferric iron activated persulfate that Provectus offers. So when I'm referring to common activated persulfate, I'm talking about persulfate that would be activated through sodium hydroxide or alkaline activation. It could be activated via iron or thermal. So that's just to distinguish between what Provectus offers. And with the sulfate radical, that also can treat a wide range of contaminants similar to the hydroxyl radical. But one of the benefits of it is it forms a little bit slower, so it can allow for a larger radius of influence in the subsurface. And then with what Provectus offers with Provectox and Provectox 2, those will also form the sulfate radical, and they also have the benefit of also being able to form ferrate on some sites as well. And in addition, they can also help prevent contaminant rebound by utilizing the residual iron and sulfate for some back-end bioremediation. So the ferric iron activation offers some advantages over common activated persulfate. As we continue to move down the chart, you can see other technologies that have lower oxidation potentials, such as hydrogen peroxide and permanganate. So talking about how this relates to contaminant destruction, well, based on the chart on the right, we can see that for our longer chain hydrocarbons, such as your PAHs, your DRO, GRO, that requires at least 2.5 volts in order to effectively remediate those contaminants. So comparing that amount of energy with the chart on the left, that shows that we need to be utilizing at least a sulfate radical to generate that amount of energy in the subsurface to effectively remediate that contaminant. You could utilize the hydroxyl radical or fluorine, but those have some drawbacks, as we just discussed. If you're looking at other contaminants of concern, such as BTEX, that requires a little bit less energy. But you can see if you were looking at something like permanganate or hydrogen peroxide, that wouldn't necessarily be generating enough energy to effectively remediate BTEX or some of your longer chain hydrocarbons. So you just want to make sure, depending on what your contaminants are, that your oxidation technology is going to be able to generate enough energy to effectively remediate your contaminants of concern. So let's dive into three of the main issues I see with chemical oxidation. The first of which is non-beneficial consumption. And so the way I like to think about when I'm designing a project site is, for your oxidant demand that's required, it's really a mathematical formula of two components. The first part of that formula is the stoichiometric demand of the contaminants. And I think this is the little bit easier section to figure out. Assuming your site's been fairly well delineated, you have a strong understanding of the groundwater and soil concentrations, this is very easy to calculate for your project site. And just to give a quick example, if you have 1 pound of benzene at your project site, that requires approximately 50 pounds of persulfate in order to effectively remediate it. The second half, I think, is a little bit harder to quantify, and that's what I call the non-beneficial consumption. This includes things like your soil matrix demand, potential metals that may be at your site, organic carbon, as well as decomposition of the oxidant. As we discussed, peroxide, it can be faster acting in the subsurface, so you need to make sure you account for that. And really the way to quantify this is through a TOD, or a total oxidant demand test. And so this is something at Provectus that we would strongly recommend doing, and we have partner labs that we can team up with to help get this done. And so I do realize that every day many chemical oxidation projects are occurring without the TOD test being done. But essentially that's a little bit risky, because I've seen those TOD tests come back and they can range in value anywhere from 1 to 2 grams per kilogram, all the way as high as 20 to 30 grams per kilogram. So just to put that into terms of how that could affect your project site, if you're making an assumption on the low end and your total oxidant demand is orders of magnitude higher, you may be potentially underdosing your site. Or if the situation is the reverse of that, you may be putting in too much product where you'll see results, but essentially you're going to be costing your clients some money in the long run. So neither a scenario which is really beneficial to anybody involved in the project. So I would strongly recommend doing a TOD test if you're working on an ISCO site. The second issue I see with chemical oxidation is just related to contaminant rebound. So this is a study from McGuire et al., where they looked at various project sites that utilized either chemical oxidation or enhanced bioremediation technologies. Now, they didn't gather any other data on these project sites other than the class of families that was utilized. And what the chart on the right shows is that at time zero, sorry about that. At time zero, for the chemical oxidation chart on the right, we can see that there's significant contaminant destruction. And then as your timeline moves out further to the right, you get less and less contaminant destruction. And this correlates with our understanding of chemical oxidation, and what we know being that they're typically faster acting technologies where you'll see reductions on the front end. If we look at the enhanced biochart on the left side, we can see that at time zero, we don't have nearly as much contaminant destruction. But as our time plot moves further and further out to the right, we can see more and more contaminant destruction occurring. And this again corresponds with the understanding of bioremediation, being that it is a little bit slower of a technology to work in the subsurface, but it does provide a little bit more longevity compared to chemical oxidation. The real sweet spot here would be is if we could combine the two classes of technologies to get the upfront reductions from the chemical oxidation and be able to sustain the reductions with bioremediation on the back end. And so the third potential issue I see with chemical oxidation is just related to the longevity of the reagents. And so let's just think about this hypothetically for a minute here, where if you have a project site, maybe they have a plume that's been leaking in the subsurface for 30, 40 years. That contaminant's been migrating into all various pore spaces and preferential pathways. And over time, that plume gets delineated, different technologies get evaluated, eventually a RAP gets implemented, and say chemical oxidation is selected. Well, now what we're looking to go out and do is apply a technology that's maybe only going to last for minutes to hours to weeks for a plume that's been migrating for potentially decades in the subsurface. And so this chart is from the EPA. It is a little bit older. If you look at the far right column, it describes some of these technologies as experimental or emerging. And I think at this point in the environmental industry, all these technologies are fairly widely accepted. But the column just to the left of that is the real key takeaway here, where it shows the persistence of these technologies. And that really hasn't changed over time. And you can see, something like ozone or Fenton's reagent, those will only last for a few minutes to hours in the subsurface. Whereas something like persulfate or permanganate, that's going to give you a little bit more longevity, say for weeks to potentially a couple months. So at Provectus, as I mentioned, we offer two technologies, which are called Provectox and Provectox 2. Not very creative on the naming, but they work great in the industry. Provectox, that's a sodium persulfate blend combined with a ferric iron activator. And Provectox 2 is a sodium and potassium persulfate blend that's also combined with the ferric iron activator. Following the implementation of these technologies, what they both will do is quickly flip the geochemistry aerobic. So you'll see significant increases in your ORPs and your DO values. you'll get those chemical oxidation reactions on the front end. And then as those reactions run their course within a few weeks to potentially months, you're going to get sustained bioremediation on the back end due to the residual iron and sulfate. So they transition very well from chemical oxidation to bioremediation. In addition, both these technologies, we also include a tear or pH buffer. The reason we do this is, unlike common activated persulfate, you're not going to see that steep precipitous pH drop that you may see afterwards. So, ideally, you're not going to see your pH in that 2 to 4 range. And then both materials are very safe, easy to handle. They're pre-blended all-in-one products. They come in either 50-pound bags or super sacks, depending on the scope and scale of your project site. And on the right-hand side there, you can actually see a picture of the product, which has the nice red color there. As I mentioned, Provectus 2, that is a combination of sodium and potassium persulfate. And the reason that we add the potassium in here is that it has an order of magnitude lower solubility than the sodium. And so what this allows for is an extended release of the oxidant for a few months compared to just weeks in the subsurface. And what this actually means for project sites then is we can utilize chemical oxidation for permeable reactive barriers for, say, larger dilute plumes, or we can also introduce it to open excavations to address residual groundwater contamination or soil blending approaches. So let's dive into a couple of the case studies that we have. The first one I have here is from a site in Madison, New Jersey, where we worked with engineering and land planning. This site consisted of LNAPL, BTEX, and trimethylbenzene impacts. And before they did any in situ work out here, they utilized the excavation to remove some of the overburden. And they also did an EFR event to remove most of the LNAPL. There was still a little bit of residual remaining in the one well. Following that remedial work, they were left with about a 1,500 square foot area that they had to remediate in situ, with our target vertical zone being from 25 to 40 feet below ground surface. Depth to water was at about 30 feet. So out here, we were targeting the smear zone and saturated zone. And the site geology consisted of dense silts and clays. And in total, 8,500 pounds of Provectus were applied in order to significantly reduce the residual mass following the excavation and EFR events. So as promised, I do have some geochemistry from this site. Initial baseline conditions from our 2 target wells out here showed both wells with strong reducing conditions. The ORPs were both greater than negative 100 millivolts. And then following the application of the Provectus, you can see that we completely flipped the geochemistry. Our ORPs went strongly on the positive side, creating aerobic conditions. And then in about 3 months following the application, baseline conditions returned as anticipated based on the longevity of the sodium persulfate and the Provectus. And now you would have the opportunity for the residual iron and sulfate to take over for the bioremediation on the back end. Here's some of the pH data that we have as well. You can see that it was pretty much neutral before, pre and post application. We only had a small dip in the one well down to about 5.9, which very quickly attenuated back. So due to the tear or pH buffer that we include with the technology, we're not seeing that steep precipitous pH drop out here. And then as far as the VOC results, we have great results here. This data is only about 12 months old, so we've run the course on the ISCO portion of the product, but we still would anticipate some more reductions going forward with the bio. And you could see from the first well, MW6R, we had great results. Both the BTEX and the trimethylbenzenes went down by more than 90%. And then at MW9, where we had the little bit of residual LNAPL, that's been completely remediated. And the BTEX has gone down by about 96%, and the trimethylbenzene's going down by about 85%. So great results, only about 12 months into the project site here so far. The second case study I have is from a project site on the East Coast of the US. This was an open excavation that contained BTEX and naphthalene contamination. And the client utilized Provectus 2, where they blended that into the open excavation with their remediation goal just to have significant mass reduction out here. In total, they did observe about 95% reductions in the BTEX components, as well as about 85% reduction in the naphthalene. The top right picture, you can see the Provectus 2 super sac being opened up, and it lets out the nice red product into the open excavation. So when you're blending that material in, it's very easy to see the color and see where you've mixed the material. And then just below that is a picture of the product staged in super sacks, which is one of the 2 packaging options we offer. So I do thank you for your time and listening to my presentation. As a reminder, I'm based in Phoenix, Arizona. Our corporate office is headquartered just outside of Chicago, Illinois. And then I have other colleagues staged in Ohio and New Jersey as well. We do offer complimentary site evaluation. So if you're working on a project site, please feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk with you. We also partner with labs for treatability studies, bench scale tests, total oxidant demand testing. We do turnkey, pay for performance. So whatever the scenario you're working on, I'd be happy to speak with you about it. And here's my contact information. If you'd like to get in touch, I'm always available via email or phone. And I'm also at the conference here in booth 501 if you'd like to stop by. Thank you very much. And I'll take any questions you have. Yes, go ahead. I believe that's classified as a PAH, so I would classify that probably in the top column there, so for the 2.5 volts. And anyone else? All right, well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. So we have a little twist here. The next presenter is going to be presenting virtually for us. Okay, Paul, you present?
I am present. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you. This is Paul Doody, Principal Engineer at Anchor QEA. His discussion today is going to be on in situ remediation of arsenic and groundwater by creating biogenic iron sulfide minerals via injections. I'm glad I get these tongue twisters this early in the morning. Absolutely. Paul, you can take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can find my screen here. Jesus, worked before. Anyways, maybe as I'm scrambling here to get my screen shared. There we go. Let me know if you can see this. As Gary had mentioned, thank you, Gary, for the introduction. If somebody could just confirm for me that you can see the...
Looking good.
We see your screen.
You need to put it in full mode, presentation mode.
You got it.
And then, yep.
There we go. Well, thank you, Gary. Things are going well so far. I am Paul Doody. I'm a principal engineer with Anchor QEA. I prepared this presentation with a colleague of mine, Christy Mitchell. I'm in Fort Myers, Florida. Christy is in our Daphne, Alabama office. And what I'm going to cover today is a in situ bioremediation and enhanced bioremediation project for the removal of arsenic in shallow groundwater. And maybe just as a matter of content, I'll provide some background information on the site itself. But spend most of the time talking about a pilot study that was completed, followed by a full site remedy, and then wrap things up with summary and conclusions, and then hopefully have some time left for some questions. So maybe start off a little bit background here, the project team, the owner, the site itself is an abandoned and former substation site with a southeastern utility. The site is in northern Florida. We are the lead consultant or engineer for the project. The owner collaborated with Auburn University, who are the principal investigators here. Several of the professors own some intellectual property that's related to the enhancement process that we used for the in situ bioremediation. Also, the National Science Foundation provided some of the funding for Auburn University, along with our client, the owner. And also want to just also mention that oversight's being provided by FDEP on this site. Maybe as a matter of background, as I mentioned, it's a former substation site. It's about 0.3 acres, so a pretty small site, where arsenic trioxide was applied as an herbicide many years ago when the site was in operation for about 31 years between 1951 and 1982. That herbicide was applied to keep down vegetative growth at the substation proper. But as you could imagine, the arsenic found its way into the shallow groundwater at levels above the site standard of 50 micrograms per liter. The groundwater contamination has been limited to the surface or the shallow groundwater. We've got about 20 to 25 feet of predominantly a sand aquifer, which is underlain by a regional clay confining layer. One of the first remediation steps, as with many of these sites, was the superficial contaminated soils were excavated and disposed off site, about 800 cubic yards of material in 1992. And then there was some ongoing groundwater monitoring. There were some reductions noted in the arsenic in the groundwater, but not to the level acceptable. So a pump and treat system was installed with re-injection and soil flushing between 1994 and 1999. Some of that arsenic had gotten off site, but that pump and treat system was successful at reducing the plume in its size down to about 20% of its maximum, and had been remaining stable for several years. So the pump and treat system was shut off. It had reached its point of diminishing returns. And then a monitoring or natural attenuation monitoring program was instituted at that time. And levels essentially had remained constant or in the same range for a number of years, and began assessing options to be able to manage that residual arsenic in the groundwater, and where an in situ approach appeared to be viable. We implemented a pilot study in 2016 and then a full site injections in 2018 with monitoring ongoing. I'm going to spend most of my time there on those last couple of bullets. So maybe a little bit on the biochemistry here. The idea here with enhancing the biological process is to take what's naturally occurring where there's sulfate reducing bacteria that are essentially taking a sulfur source that you can add to the aquifer. So if you provide sulfur and an iron source in the form of ferrous sulfate is what we used here, and stimulate those bacteria to with some carbon source. There's a number of sources listed here. We ended up going with a molasses at this particular site, but be able to stimulate those bacteria. Those bacteria are going to produce H2S, which then combines with the iron to make an iron sulfide, and in our case is a pyrite material. And those iron sulfides were shown to incorporate the arsenic into their crystalline structure, where the arsenic absorbs onto those surfaces. A couple of photos I've got here. You can see in the upper right-hand corner is the sulfate reducing bacteria that was shown to be at the site. And then the bottom panel is a scanning electron microscope photo of framboidal pyrite from the site as well. So some investigations back in 2005, we found that black precipitate was collecting in the bottom of some of the monitoring wells at the site. And some of the data that we collected indicated that precipitate contained arsenic, iron, and sulfur, and that the levels of arsenic that were in that precipitate were, on the order of 0.2 to 1% arsenic, which is highly concentrated. The levels in the groundwater at the site are generally in the sub ppm level, so highly concentrated in the precipitate. Some X-ray diffraction analysis confirmed that we had pyrite. You see that lower right-hand panel is an X-ray diffractogram of precipitate from one of the wells at the site. And in addition to that, the sulfur isotopes that were observed in the solids were enriched in sulfur 32, which would indicate that that the sulfur is some biogenic origin. And I'll indicate later, but the groundwater was enriched in sulfur 34. So really indicated a strong biogenic origin. And we determined that we were able to accelerate that process in the laboratory, but wanted to test that in the field with a pilot study. And what's shown here is a figure of the site. Again, I had mentioned it's about 0.3 acres in size, so you can imagine a substation, not a real big property size-wise. But the blue arrows there indicate the general direction of groundwater flow, which is in the northwest to westerly direction. The existing monitoring wells that were used during the pilot study are there in green. And we did install 2 injection wells. You can see in the blue there, I1 and I2, and installed 2 monitoring wells immediately down gradient to give us some, we'll say some timely data related to groundwater movement and the front of some of the chemicals that we were going to inject into the system. The green dash line represents the plume boundary at the 50 ppb level for arsenic. So just some photos here. So we installed the injection wells I mentioned, or the flush mounted, to make it easier to gravity drain the injection fluids. And then the stick up well there is one of the monitoring wells that was installed. Some of the piping you see down in the lower left-hand corner is just some of the relic abandoned piping from the groundwater pump and treat system that had been abandoned. So the injection solutions that we tested during the pilot, we did 2 different solutions. One was more concentrated than the other, and also varied the amount of total volume of fluid that we applied in each of the wells. But the solution consisted of water. We used a demineralized water from a local power plant. There was some concern with using chlorinated water and that it might affect the biological activity. So we used a demineralized water, and we added a ferrous sulfate. You can see the amount of ferrous sulfate that was added. We also added a fertilizer and molasses. And as I mentioned, tested 2 different solution strengths. Pretty simple process, a tote tank where the materials were mixed. You can see the gravity drainage hose that would run out to each of the injection wells, and use the valve there to do some primary control of flow. And then at the well itself, we had an observer there full time during the pilot study. And basically, the intent was to try to not create too significant groundwater mounding, and to the operator, he regulated the flow basically with his foot to just kind of keep the flow so that we weren't increasing the elevation in the well too dramatically. So a pretty simple process. Some of the findings we had was that we did see sulfide precipitates forming in the wells. We analyzed that precipitate, or Auburn University did a lot of this analytical work. They identified that precipitate as a pyrite. They also detected the iron, sulfur, and arsenic in those precipitates, and identified the sulfate reducing bacteria, kind of all 3 pieces of evidence that we'd seen historically, but we also were able to document occurred during the pilot study. We also saw the geochemical changes that we had expected, changes in ORP, H2S concentrations, iron and sulfate concentrations as well. I'd mentioned earlier, we saw the lighter isotopes of sulfur accumulating in the solids and the heavier isotopes in the groundwater. And most importantly, we did see a decrease in arsenic concentrations in the groundwater. Finally, as I indicated, we tested 2 different solutions. The reason we did that was wanted to make sure that the higher concentration fluid didn't inhibit the sulfate reduction, but would allow us to apply less water to the aquifer. And we ended up showing that that higher concentration solution was acceptable, so we recommended that for the full site remedy. So I'll go through some of that information from the pilot. I had mentioned these black precipitates that form in the wells. One of the ways we collected this was we put in the sand packets. You can see the picture on the left before they were installed, and then retrieving them after the pilot study. And you can see them on the right there with obvious black staining, and we were able to obtain enough of that precipitate to be able to run some of those analyses that I had mentioned. We also did some analysis of those, this X-ray diffractogram. The red peaks that you see there are indicative of the pyrite, and the samples that Auburn University ran matched an Arsenian pyrite with the formula that's noted there in the figure. We also wanted to point out some of these water chemistry changes over time. I'll explain this graph for you. The x-axis here is time in days. We ran this for, I believe, 9 to 12 months, and we're just kind of showing the first 6 months here. The left-hand y-axis is the concentration of iron and sulfate. That's a linear scale. And on the right-hand y-axis, we've got the concentrations of arsenic and H2S, and that's a log scale. We did that mainly so we could see the changes over time with each of these parameters. The red line is that arsenic standard of 50 micrograms per liter. And a couple of key observations here. You'll see the green and the black lines, which are the iron and sulfate concentrations. No surprise, after the injections at day 0, you saw an increase in those, which is what you would expect. The H2S concentrations also went up, indicating that that we're getting that sulfate reduction into H2S. And the arsenic concentrations in the blue line, you can see dropped from what they were before or at day 0 or before the injections, and down actually below the standard in that particular monitoring well. This was the monitoring well that was one of the ones that was installed just down gradient of the injection wells. One of the things we did observe, this is a graph of the arsenic concentrations in 3 of the monitoring wells. The red and blue are the 2 wells that were installed just down gradient of the injection wells, and the black line is a well that's side gradient or slightly up gradient from the injection wells. And one of the things we did observe is after about 8 months or so, I think in the 8th or 9th month, we started to see an increase in those wells that were down gradient of the injection wells. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't seeing a rebound here based on the data. And a couple of things we wanted to point out on that was that side gradient well also showed the increase. We also had seen historically that groundwater elevation can affect the arsenic levels. We had seen in some of the wells anyways, lower groundwater elevations resulting in higher arsenic levels. So we thought that might have been a potential explanation. And we did see that increase in RA12. So that was one possibility. We didn't see any increase in the iron sulfate or ORP in those monitoring wells. And so that indicated to us that these sulfides were not dissolving. So the consensus really is that the arsenic increase that we saw wasn't due to a rebound or a dissolution of the arsenic out of that pyrite that had been forming, but rather was due to untreated groundwater that had moved into the area of the monitoring wells. If you recall from that graphic of the site, that the wells were installed not at the upgradient boundary of the arsenic, but were kind of in the middle of the plume. So not surprising that over time we saw some of the untreated groundwater coming into our monitoring wells and influencing those concentrations. So we moved ahead with the full site injection, and one of the things we wanted to make sure we did was to capture and be able to inject our reagent into all of the areas where we had arsenic above the standard of 50 micrograms per liter. So we installed a number of temporary well points, about 20 of them throughout the site, to help guide where we would put the injection wells. And then we installed, I think we've got a total of 11 injection wells. They're shown in yellow. They show up in yellow on my screen, maybe yellow or orange on your screen. Those are the injection wells. One of those was installed, or two of those were installed during the pilot. And then we added 9 injection wells to use in the full site remedy. The black and white wells are the monitoring wells, the existing monitoring wells that we have at the site. And then the groundwater flow, again, direction is shown in the blue there. What we did is we injected about 6,600 gallons of that higher concentrated solution, ended up being about 500 to 1,000 gallons per well. And we basically hopscotched around each of the wells and injected 250 gallons at a time in each of the wells. At 3 of the wells, we noted that they weren't taking the water as well as the others, a little bit lower permeability. And so we modified our injection technique at those wells, and I'll show you a couple of pictures here. We did this in 2018, basically the same setup with that truck mounted tank, where we mixed things and then gravity drained into each of the injection wells. And then we used a modified rain barrel for some of these low permeability wells. It allowed us to run a lower flow into those and not have to man the operation full time like we were with the larger tank. And so we did that at 3 of the wells. And then just wanted to show that similar graph that we had that I showed for the pilot study. Again, it's the same setup. That vertical dashed line is the injection date. And so again, you see the iron and sulfate in the black and green lines increased after the injection to no surprise, and then dropped off over time. The H2S, not as much of a dramatic increase after the injection, but it did increase and essentially maintained over time. There is that little drop that you see in December or November of 2018. That was a non-detect reading. H2S is a field measurement, so we believe that just is an anomalous reading. And most importantly, the blue line, which is the arsenic concentrations, and in this case, it's total arsenic. You see that dropping over time. And one thing I would point out is we've been monitoring through 2021 here, and through the data that we have collected to date, these levels, the arsenic levels have been holding and still below the pre-injection concentrations. So maybe as a summary and some conclusions, we were fortunate to have a site that was conducive to enhancing the existing biological activity at the site with a pretty simple system. And we had these natural processes that we knew were occurring and that enhancement was possible. And we worked with Auburn using some of their intellectual property to enhance that work and implement a pilot study and then the full site injection. The pilot study, we were able to demonstrate there were arsenic reductions and the processes that were going on were corroborated with the ORP and precipitate analysis, as well as the iron, sulfate, and H2S monitoring. We did see that evidence of potential rebound, but believe that that was likely that flush of upgradient contaminated groundwater into our treatment and monitoring zone. And then we've got 2 full years after the full site injection. We don't see any rebound and demonstrating these arsenic reductions. About 90% of the wells are below the pre-injection levels, or many of them are also below the site standard. So I think that's it. I guess I'll open it up for questions if folks have them. I would ask if folks do have questions, Gary, either repeat the question or if folks have a microphone or some way, because I can't hear the questions when some of the other speakers were talking.
We do have microphones, and your first one is coming up in a second.
Yes, hi, thanks, great presentation. If the redox conditions change back, does the pyrite stay in its form, or does it start releasing arsenic back or desorbing off of it?
Yeah, I think that's a real good question. I think, you know, what we've seen thus far after that, we had anticipated maybe we would have to do some sequential reactions and concern, you know, with that rebound we saw during the pilot study, but we have not seen that in the full scale. And, you know, we're going to continue to monitor the arsenic levels semi-annually, which is a requirement we have, and keep a close eye on that. So we haven't seen that, but and we do see the ORP levels. They're slightly oxidizing in their natural state, and we did see that you know, that precipitate had formed in before any kind of injections were employed, and we saw that in monitoring wells. So our feeling is that, and we've been monitoring ORP, and we see that kind of hovering a little bit back towards oxidizing, but we haven't seen anything with the arsenic. So hope that answers your question. Others?
Yeah, Paul, why did you choose to gravity feed versus low pressure inject? And the other question is, why did you choose molasses versus something a little easier to deal with, like sodium lactate or another carbon source?
Yeah, so the honestly, I don't remember when I got involved, the molasses decision had been made, so I don't know, but I could get that answer for you and get back to you. Maybe if you want to reach out to me, I can get that answer to you. As far as the gravity feed, it seemed like the simple operation. The aquifer was able to accept that volume in a reasonable period of time, where someone could stand there and make sure it gravity fed adequately without doing you know, excessive mounding of the water table. So it was simple, and it worked in the pilot, so we just carried it on in the full scale. With that modification, with the couple of wells where it didn't, you know, didn't take the water as quickly as most of the other wells. It is a sand aquifer, so it worked out pretty well for us.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Just a moment, one more question on the way.
Sure.
So my experience is when you do reductive treatment of groundwater with arsenic, one of the consequences is that you get arsenic 5 compounds being reduced to arsenic 3 compounds, which are more soluble and more mobile. So you actually might increase your dissolve phase arsenic. Did you look for this and did you see this at all?
Well, we did monitor both total and filtered arsenic, and both showed a reduction over time. I don't know about the speciation question that you had, whether we saw some disproportionate change in the speciation. But I can get an answer to that because I'm confident that Auburn and our investigator also looked at that.
Yeah, the good news is that it usually will go back, once you go back to baseline. So you might actually see a transient increase and your regulators will get all concerned and then, next quarter they'll be okay. But just
Yeah,
FYI.
great point. Yeah, no, great point. I appreciate it. Any others, Gary?
Oh, Paul, I think we're all set.
Pardon me, just the length of your monitoring period, what is that?
Well, we've got, I think, an indefinite monitoring period moving forward, but the monitoring we've done since the injections, we've got 3 years worth of data. I didn't mention this, but there was more frequent monitoring right after the injections, and now we're to a semi-annual monitoring period. And we report it annually to FDEP.
Okay, Paul, I think that is it. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time.
I would like to mention too, if any questions come to mind, it looks like we're going to have a little time at the end of the session here for the panel. If you forgot something and want to mention it, we might have some question and answer time available. So the next presentation is Jenna Martin, PE project engineer for GHD. Our co-presenter Derek Berry are going to present on in situ chemical oxidation and aerobic bioremediation decreases petroleum contaminants in inaccessible aquifers.
All right, well, thank you. As Gary said, my name is Jenna Martin, and I am a professional engineer with GHD, and I will be presenting with Derek Berry, who is a geologist with GHD. And so today we're going to be presenting on how we used in situ chemical oxidation, or ISCO, and aerobic bioremediation to treat petroleum contaminants in an inaccessible aquifer at one of our petroleum sites in Tallahassee. All right, so our agenda for today, we're going to first give a brief site background, and then we're going to provide a summary of the previous contamination assessment as well as the previous remedial activities. We'll discuss the recent ISCO remedial activities and then finish up with a review of our groundwater trends. So Derek's going to start us off with our site background.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jenna. So the Time Saver 11 facility is a former retail service station located in a predominantly residential area of Tallahassee. The facility operated as a retail service station beginning in 1985 when 3 unleaded gasoline USTs were installed. The USTs and dispensers were located in the southeast portion of the site, as you can see in the 2011 aerial photograph. So it's kind of right there where you can see the canopy structure. And in August 1990, a petroleum release was reported following discovery of a broken fiberglass pipe, and an estimated 1,000 gallons of unleaded gasoline was released prior to detection. So the site was deemed eligible for state-funded cleanup under the Petroleum Liability Insurance and Restoration Program and has a current priority cleanup score of 61. Initial remedial activities included conducted at the site included the removal and replacement of the USTs and the excavation and disposal of approximately 420 tons of petroleum impacted soil to depths of approximately 14 feet below land surface. Fueling continued at the on-site until 2008 when the replacement USTs were removed. No additional storage or fueling has taken place on site since that time, and the canopy and fuel dispensers were ultimately removed in 2011. The site is currently used as a convenience store only, as depicted in the 2021 photograph. Okay, so now I'll go over some of the initial contamination and assessment activities conducted at the site and the extent of the impacts. So the site assessment activities were conducted by others between 1996 and 2008. The soil impacts were identified in the former UST and dispenser area in the southeastern portion of the site, and extensive groundwater impacts were identified, which extended eastward offsite in the direction of groundwater flow. So you can kind of see, is this a pointer here? Oh, whoops, it's back. So right here was where the old canopy structure was. You can kind of see the plume extending offsite in the eastward direction here. So where was it? And so the petroleum impacts migrated over about 750 feet eastward, and that extended into a stormwater retention pond right here and continued further beyond that. And vertically, the impacts were detected at depths greater than about 45 feet. The water table at the site has varied considerably from the depth of water ranging from about 12 to 20 feet in the shallow wells, and then from about 20 to 45 feet in the deep wells. The site also has a complex lithology consisting of alternating layers of fine sands, silty sands, clays, and limestone. So several pilot tests were conducted by others at the site in order to develop a remedial strategy, including air sparge and soil vapor extraction, as well as a pump and treat test. However, ASSVE was determined not to be an acceptable remedial strategy due to the complex lithology at the site, including a perched aquifer, confining clay layers, and inconsistent lithologies. Similarly, groundwater extraction and hydraulic control pilot test was determined not to be an effective remedial strategy due to the low groundwater yield of the formation. Since previously mentioned remedial strategies were deemed ineffective, previous consultants prepared a wrap for source removal via large diameter augers to remove the vadose and smear zone soil impacts and to attempt to reduce further migration of the down gradient plume. In 2008, soil excavation activities consisting of 68 LDA borings were completed to depths of approximately 25 feet. An oxygen release compound was placed in each borehole and prior to backfilling with flowable fill to promote further bioremediation of the groundwater. In total, about approximately 1,700 tons of soil was excavated and disposed of off-site. However, groundwater concentrations remain substantially unchanged from the 2007 concentrations, and it was suspected that smear zone impacts remained between the LDA borings and the nearby street, which is Callaway Street, to the east, where these impacts were inaccessible for removal due to the presence of underground and overhead utilities. So following the LDA excavations, a wrap mod was proposed in 2013 for ISCO and bioamendment injections, targeting the on-site groundwater plume and any remaining smear zone and soil impacts that were previously inaccessible. ISCO with bioamendments was selected as it has been successfully utilized in restrictive formations like the clay soils encountered on site, where desorption of petroleum contaminants typically limits the use of conventional technology such as ASSVE or pump and treat tests, as the pilot testing for these two strategies demonstrated. The ISCO injections were also selected as the accessible on-site hydrocarbon source had already been removed, and the remaining off-site dissolved phase hydrocarbon mass was located down gradient, mostly in inaccessible areas under the roadways and along the utility right-of-ways. So ISCO involves the injection of strong oxidants into the soil and groundwater matrix to oxidize the target hydrocarbons. The oxidant can be injected through targeted direct push injection points or through injection wells as shown in this diagram. As the oxidant comes into contact with hydrocarbons, it breaks down the chemical compounds in that area and converts the compounds into more or less harmful byproducts. And And with the addition of the oxygen release compound, a long-term oxygen source is provided in the groundwater to promote in situ bioremediation. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Jenna, who will give you more detail for the injection events that GHD conducted.
Thank you, Derek. So GHD implemented the RAP mod in 2016. We performed 2 ISCO injection events. The first was conducted in January of 2016, and we injected the ISCO and biomimetic material into 30 direct push injection points, which are the green symbols on our map to the left. And we injected the ISCO and biomimic material to depths of 12 to 30 feet below land surface to try and target those smear zone impacts as well as the shallow groundwater impacts. And you can see where we have the picture of that direct push rig that was within that on-site retention pond performing those injection activities. And if you look behind the drill rig, you can also see those overhead power lines that run along the eastern boundary of our site, which limited how far eastward we could place those points. So the second event was conducted in May of 2016, and similarly, we injected the ISCO and biomimic material into 30 different injection points. And again, with that interval of 12 to 30 feet below land surface, targeting that smear zone area as well as the shallow groundwater impacts. So following the injection activities, we conducted groundwater monitoring through 2018, and you can see that the extent of our plume did shrink and the concentrations in some of our source area wells did decrease, especially along the eastern boundary of the property. However, they still remained above GCTLs and even NADCs. So, and we also had significant impacts that remained south of that city of Tallahassee retention pond to the east. So in order to try and target those remaining impacts and to expedite the site cleanup process, we proposed the preparation of a RAP mod for additional remediation. So during the development of our RAP mod, we were again limited in the type of remediation we could use due to the complex lithology, the presence of overhead and underground utilities, as well as the extent of the plume that was present beneath the roadways. So we proposed additional ISCO injections, but we proposed doing them to deeper depths of 20 to 50 feet below land surface to try and target both the shallow groundwater impacts as well as the deeper groundwater impacts that were present. And we also proposed angling those injection borings. This picture here, you can see another view of those overhead lines that run along the eastern boundary. And 2 of our hot wells are located almost directly beneath those overhead lines. So in order to deliver the ISCO material to that area, we proposed angling those injection borings to try and reach the area beneath the power lines, as well as some of the impacts that extended into Callaway Street to the east. And then we also received approval from the city of Tallahassee to perform injection borings along the southern boundary of that retention pond. And we again proposed angling those injection points to try and reach some of those impacts beneath the roadway. The ISCO and biomimic material that we selected for this project was PeroxyChem's Closure CR. So it's a single formulated product that consists of 50% high pH alkaline activated persulfate and 50% engineered calcium peroxide. And so it utilizes the strength of both of these products to treat the contaminant source zones as well as the down gradient plumes. So the high pH activated persulfate is capable of destroying a wide range of petroleum contaminants through the generation of sulfate and hydroxyl radicals. And then we get the diffusion and transport of oxygen from the calcium peroxide that helps promote the degradation of the compounds in the down gradient plumes. So the ISCO in the source area will typically last 3 to 6 months, while the long-term enhanced aerobic bioremediation will typically extend up to 1 year. And you can see in our pictures here, the closure CR is typically supplied as a dry powder, and then we mixed it on site in mixing totes with water into an aqueous slurry before we injected it through the DPT tooling into the subsurface. So we performed 2 additional ISCO injection events in July and September of 2019. And the purple and the green symbols on our map depict the locations of the first and second injection events respectively. And so we offset those second injection points to try and make sure we had sufficient coverage of the ISCO material into the subsurface. And again, we angled those injection borings about 40 degrees from vertical to try and target those inaccessible areas beneath the power lines as well as underneath the roadways. In total, we injected about 7,400 pounds of closure CR into the subsurface during each event. And we again targeted that interval of 20 to 50 feet below land surface. So this map here depicts the most recent analytical results that were collected in October of 2020. And over the next few slides, we're going to take a look at two of our groundwater monitoring wells and the groundwater trends in those wells following the implementation of the ISCO injection activities. So our first is monitoring well MW3R. This is a shallow well that intersects the water table, and it's located along the eastern boundary of the site. And it's one of those wells that's located almost beneath those power lines. And then our second well is DW4, which is an offsite deep well. It's installed to a depth of 51 feet, and it's located in the sidewalk south of that City of Tallahassee holding pond. So taking a look at the groundwater trends for monitoring well MW3R, the table on the graph here depict the concentrations from 2015 when GHD was retained by the DEP to begin work on this site through the most recent sampling event in October of 2020. And so those 2015 concentrations, those were after the LDA source removal, but before the implementation of any of those ISCO injections. So you can see that we've seen an overall decreasing trend in concentrations. For example, the benzene concentration was decreased from around 1,500 micrograms per liter to 88 micrograms per liter, which is a 94% reduction. And we also saw the toluene and ethylbenzene concentrations decrease from concentrations well above NADCs to below their GCTLs. Similarly, in our offsite deep well, DW4, that's located south of that City of Tallahassee pond, we've also seen significant reductions in concentration. You can see some of the reductions here on this slide. And although the ethylbenzene and total xylene concentrations are still above NADCs, we've seen a 70% reduction in ethylbenzene and an 89% reduction in total xylenes. So still a significant reduction when you compare them to those 2015 pre-injection concentrations. In reviewing the data, we also took a look at the correlation between the groundwater elevation and the groundwater concentrations. As Derek had mentioned, the water table at this site has varied considerably historically. And as you can see, based on the groundwater elevation in blue versus the BTEX concentrations for monitoring well MW3R in orange, there does appear to be a relationship between the two. Generally, as the groundwater elevation decreased, the concentrations decreased, and as the groundwater elevation increased, the concentrations increased. So this revealed to us that there's probably still some contaminant mass that's located in those inaccessible site soils that's contributing to our groundwater contamination. Between our July 2020 and October 2020 sampling events, the water table rose about 5 feet, which correlates to that increase in concentrations you can see in those graphs, although these are still well below the 2015 concentrations. So we not only saw a reduction in the magnitude of the petroleum constituent contaminations, we also saw a reduction in the extent of the plume. So this map here depicts the initial extent of the plume, which extended beyond the eastern adjoining City of Tallahassee holding pond. Following the LDA source removal, although the bulk of the soil contaminant mass on site was removed, the groundwater plume was substantially unchanged. And then following the implementation of the injections beginning in 2016, we began to see a decrease in the extent of the plume, which continued following the 2019 injections to the current extent of our groundwater plume. So in summary, there was a petroleum release at our time saver site that had resulted in a significant on and off site groundwater plume. Multiple remedial events have been conducted, including the LDA source removal to remove the bulk of the soil contaminant mass on site, as well as multiple ISCO injection events to try and target the smear zone impacts, as well as the on and off site groundwater plumes. And the groundwater trends have revealed fluctuations in concentrations with changes in groundwater elevation, which reveals there may still be some inaccessible contaminant mass that's absorbed to the soils. And unfortunately, the site has nearly reached its funding cap under the PLERT program, so additional action will be limited. And a conditional closure is likely going to be the path forward for this particular site. But our groundwater monitoring has revealed that the ISCO injections were highly successful in not only decreasing the extent of the plume, but also decreasing the magnitude of the concentrations that were present. And with that, we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Jenna, how much effect did the large diameter augers have on your strategy? I mean, did you use calcium peroxide as an amendment when there was backfilled, and were you taking that into account when you designed the strategy?
They did put some ISCO biomin material into those LDA borings when they performed those. So we knew there had been, some attempt at that location there previously, but we looked at, based on the lithology of the site, as well as the success of the peroxychem chemical and other type formations as our best strategy as far as trying to treat those groundwater, particularly the down gradient plume.
Hey, Jenna, this is Sunil. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Was the conditional closure discussed with the owner before any of these later remediation efforts started?
That I am not actually sure of. I know the site, they had reached out to them because we were reaching their funding cap, but I'm not sure of the current status of what the communication with the owner is.
Okay.
Good morning, Jenna. Quick question. What about the off-site remaining contamination? Do you have to chase that, or they're okay with leaving that in place, the Florida DEP, please?
As far as the closure strategy, that still has to get worked out with DEP, but there are wells that are beyond the extent of the plume that are present that have been demonstrated to be clean. So it does appear to be delineated and, at this point, stable or shrinking.
What's for everybody?
After the LDA, did you see a spike in pH? Because we've seen it go up to 11 before, and I didn't know if that would affect your bio strategy.
There is several years in between when the LDAs were performed versus when the ISCO injection activities were performed. So by the time we were performing the injection, the pHs were around baseline.
Thank you, Derek and Jenna, for that presentation. Is there any more questions for the panel to end the session, you guys? Anything additional? Okay, we got 15 minutes or so left. John, can you pass out the 100 question multiple choice? And we need to finish that before lunchtime prior to the eating. No, enjoy, you guys. Thank you very much for your attention to the session, and thank you to all the presenters. Thank you.